So good evening and welcome to Missio Dei, what lockdown is teaching us about mission. My name's Emma Nash and I'm in the evangelism and growth team. I'm joined tonight by Bridget Down, who's an officer in the Southwest region of the Learning Network, Jessica Dalton, an officer in the London region of the Learning Network, and Peter Dominy, who's a Baptist minister, church planter and social entrepreneur in Southend. We are in very strange times, are we not? Everything is changing, and tonight we're thinking in particular about what these changes are meaning for mission in its broadest sense. Bridget, you've been thinking a little bit about the kinds of things that are changing, the norms that are being challenged in terms of how we do church, in terms of how we do mission, and even perhaps in terms of how we understand God. So do get us started, please, on this idea of the norms that are being challenged at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Emma, for inviting me to be part of this. This is great. So tonight I'm going to just introduce us to the themes of what Methodist norms are being challenged during lockdown. Because Methodism has these four elements to our calling: worship, learning and caring, service and evangelism. And all of these have been shaken and stirred and exposed by lockdown. I have spoken recently about how church has been stripped naked without the formal building and presence of each other's company. We, the church, Jesus' followers, are now alone, standing without that shield of righteousness, the shelter of contact with others, the carrying from leaders. We hold our own responsibility more than ever. The four elements of our calling are now seen without a shroud. The mission statements, aims and objectives a gathered church once held now are more than ever waiting to be used. But are we, the church, being true to that calling? I'm not sure. How is the church responding, and what does that tell us about what is important to the church? How is our response showing us what is important? Does its response give us a clue as to what the future of our church will look like? Will we think more shyly on making grand mission statements in the future, or will we take a bolder approach? Worship is the Methodist tradition, is about community, being together. From its inception with the class system through to today, the Methodist Church has built a foundation of worship as an inclusive, open experience, joining people together from all backgrounds. Worship throughout the Bible was seen out amongst people, not closed away nor private. And those are important things to remember as we go on in our discussions. Learning and caring is predominantly about listening. It's about providing that moment, building the trust, walking a journey with people, not leading them to an ultimate decision. But learning to value others in a way that helps each party to grow. And I really believe in that. And then service. Jesus' ministry shows that indissoluble nexus between word and deed. How can we have a gospel without service? Jesus' blueprint was for his followers to heal, to address injustice, to understand the struggles people face, and ultimately to do this for God's kingdom, to mirror Jesus. When we pronounce that your trust has made you whole, now go in shalom, and to therefore recognize that service should not be a separate arm of the church, but to be intrinsically within each member to bring completeness for all. And then the final one, the evangelism. In its literal sense, this is speaking out the good news. In the Methodist tradition, we see a desire for evangelism to be culturally relevant and sensitive. And at the heart of this outworking and understanding that evangelism is for all. It's not merely for the ordained or trained, but every Jesus follower. Often the local lay people understand the community best. their living out their faith can speak beyond the words of the pulpit. We offer this theme for us all to ponder tonight about these norms. In what ways are the Methodist norms, our being, our very calling, being challenged through lockdown? And hopefully we'll see the good news, okay? Let's look at the good news amongst all the dust and rubble. Churches who have abandoned the day clothes for the scrubs of getting to grips with the Missio Dei, the God-ordained, the pure creative spirit of Jesus and his followers that are living out the gospel challenge to go and be. That's our introduction to that one, Emma.
Thanks, Bridget. Lots to think about there. I love what you say about changing from day clothes into scrubs, particularly appropriate metaphor at the moment. And that this idea of the church being stripped naked. I know you did threaten to show a photo tonight, but you decided that wouldn't be appropriate. We don't want to get shut down by Zoom. But yes, fascinating, isn't it? The idea of church being stripped naked.
Yeah, I just feel that at this moment in time, that nakedness is, the church has provided protection for people. So it's two arms. The people are now without that shield, without that covering. They have to take responsibility for themselves. For an example, I'm a mum of 4, and so I can't rely on the youth worker, I can't rely on the children's worker, I can't rely on our pastors. It's to me as a mum to be fostering that faith at home stuff. And then also, I'm really passionate that churches with grand mission statements, they've been stripped naked, essentially. What are they doing? Are they out there? Are they living up to their mission statements, their aims and their beliefs? And ultimately, those 4 callings of Methodism.
That's great, thank you. Bridget, Peter, what struck you from that introduction?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, so Peter Dominy, really good to be here tonight. I just wrote down a few words as you went through. There was something around communal and inclusive, and the whole challenge being stripped bare. Some people on the more edges of the community being stripped more bare than others, and perhaps more marginalised already, so something around that. But really fascinating, when Bridget spoke, she talked about trust in terms of caring and listening and walking with. There's some difficulties there around trying to establish trust with people, as well as more challenges as to what that might look like. That pinged up for me as an initial response. Yeah.
I think linked to that idea of trust, I'm really struck by what Bridget says around responsibility, because that's such a Methodist value, isn't it? You know, Wesley's earliest considerations were around helping the people to grow in personal holiness, and one of his big objections to the establishment he found himself in was he felt that people weren't being enfranchised to know God for themselves and to grow in personal holiness. He felt that the relationship with the establishment was to the detriment of the laity. That was, you know, hugely important in why Methodism is the way it is, and why it started anyway, and why it couldn't find a home in the establishment at the time. And this is almost a litmus test, I think. A litmus test we haven't asked for and we wouldn't want in this way, but actually, have we walked that walk that Wesley was talking about at the beginning? Have we enfranchised people to have responsibility for their own faith and to grow in holiness in, you know, as Emma says, and I'm sure we'll say it lots of times this evening, in circumstances that are unusual. But I do think that's a really interesting idea to hold on to, because I think we're seeing some places where maybe we've got that really right and where people have been really equipped, and maybe places where actually we've fallen short in that regard.
Thank you. It's interesting that one of the things that I'm hearing is that perhaps we're being more Methodist than ever at the moment, or at least there's a possibility. I was struck by what Bridget said about how worship used to be out in public, and not behind walls and digitally. That's kind of where we are now. Peter, you and I were having a chat about, you had some ideas that you've been thinking a lot around sacred and secular space and sacred and secular time as well. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so yeah, it's really good to be with you tonight. So here are a few thoughts just to set us going. But first of all, don't look at me. I know Emma said that get your gallery view, whatever, up just so you can just see my face. I think it's great that you can nose into everyone else's personal spaces. So you can see what's on the wall behind them. You can have a look into their lives. And perhaps that's a really interesting intro to one thing that's happened because of what we're doing now and lockdown. There's been a change in what you might call space and time. It all sounds a bit Star Trek-y, but hopefully not too much so. So here we go. So think about the sacred first. You might want to think about somewhere rather special, somewhere set apart. You might want to use a word like a thin space or a thin place. Perhaps it's laced with meanings and stories and a place where you can connect with God. Perhaps that's to you somewhere you go normally, which you can't now. Perhaps that's somewhere you go on Sundays. If you're from some church traditions, it's very much a particular room and space, but we find ourselves now in different spaces. Or perhaps it's not the first three dimensions, so like the where, but the fourth dimension of when, and when we're meeting has been disrupted to a certain extent as well. So the idea of sacred plays out well in the Old Testament, where it's about a boundary around it, and it's there, and not this profane, this secular, this other. It's been crumbled away, it's been broken down. So that's a bit sort of, it's a bit conceptual, you might say, a bit of theology of space and time. And then as you start to think about that, and you think about these spaces which you may not have access to, and with all their rich meanings and stories, and you remember when that happened there or this happened there, then perhaps let's just jump for a moment to Jesus. And I'll just suggest to you, Jesus is a bit like COVID-19, because Jesus sometimes played around with space and time. When he walked his 3 years, he wasn't very interested in the key space, was he? Jerusalem. He went there at the end, but generally he was out in the sticks, in the secondary places. Second biggest city in the region, he never even got to, according to the gospel accounts. Doesn't get a mention. And when he did get into that sacred town, Jerusalem, and those sacred places like the temple, he turned the tables over, he disrupted them, and then he ripped the curtain. And surely that's a dramatic change in that space, in his crucifixion, where the temple curtain was ripped in two. And you might want to domesticate that so we get access into God, or you might want to think about that as in flowing out from God, his spirit, into our world. It's a play on space and time, and the question of where we get to meet with God. So I don't know about you, but for me, as I've been going through these strange last, whatever it is, 9 weeks of time, the where has dropped away to a certain extent. There's the normal places I can't access. When has become open to reshaping as new patterns emerge. But then I see myself with a few temptations in all this. One, I quite like the idea of rebuilding my temples, whatever those mean to me. Trying to go back to the familiar, to some certainty again. And second, if this is some sort of enforced, you might call it a sabbatical. That's another understanding of the fourth dimension time, the sabbatical. This enforced sabbatical we're now all having. A sabbatical in one sense is a stop, it's a void. A bit like rebuilding a temple, I want to cram that void with new things rather than stepping back and leaving space for new things to emerge. So perhaps this first thing I'm contributing is all rather conceptual, but yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you. Yeah, so it sounds as if what you're saying, Peter, and I love the rather alarming statement that Jesus is like COVID-19 or COVID-19 is like Jesus. But it sounds like you're saying that the lockdown certainly it is in a sense breaking down barriers, perhaps opening up, breaking down church walls, maybe that God is kind of entering our homes and not just remaining in these so-called sacred places. Not that he was ever contained by them, but perhaps there's an awareness on our part that he's not contained by them.
Yeah,
Bridget, I mean, sorry, Peter.
Oh God. Yeah, I was just going to say, I like to say, church isn't a building, but the church from scratch I'm involved in doesn't meet in buildings. But then what I find actually I've inserted that building, those three dimensions, I've inserted a fourth dimension in it's Monday night at 8, Sunday morning at 10. It doesn't matter when I've put various programs, which might be great and helpful. in the place, and all those are being stripped away. So a bit like the nakedness idea it gave us, I think, in one sense. We haven't collaborated on the words we're going to use tonight, but yeah, there's some synergy there.
So I've just done some research, some really basic research of people that I know on my friends list on my Facebook account, and interestingly, Peter, is really interesting that two comments that people have come up with as a positive from lockdown, involving churches' unity, about the fact that they can now, they're working without walls. And actually people from sacred and secular backgrounds, they're all coming together for one. We've got one combined unity, haven't we? We've got this thing that we are all experiencing together, even if we experience it in different ways. The other massive thing, and the profound thing that has come out of this, is that people feel closer to God right now, that they're finding that in their personal time that they have that space, they have that freedom to explore God in a totally different way. And that's what I love about what you've just said about that sort of breaking, that crumbling of the boundaries. And I think that research really meets it there. So yeah, out of 50 responses, that was the top thing.
At the same time, if I'm honest,
sorry, Peter,
in all that openness, but my human instinct is to cram a load of stuff back into it, try and reassemble some of the old, morph it into a new pattern and jam it into my life, or I'm a minister in the life of my church as well.
Yeah,
I'm really interested in some of what might some of the reasons that might underlie a desire to return to buildings. And I've been writing a lot recently about how we might understand that conflict from the point of view of feminist theology, which may appeal to some people and may not appeal to others, and have been thinking a lot about the domestic space and how we feel about the domestic space, and this idea that we're now engaging with the things that we would normally engage with in a church building. We're engaging with them in our homes and around our kitchen table. And I was very interested in some of the debate that sprung up around Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, celebrating the Eucharist from his kitchen table, and that really polarised people. And one of the things I wanted to explore around that was actually, when we strip it away, what is it because we view the domestic space as less? And why is that, when we think that actually a lot of sacred work goes on in the home? But I was also on a slightly more mundane level. I was saying to a friend recently that I've been quite enjoying watching our Sunday morning broadcast in my PJs with a croissant, maybe a little bit later than I usually would, because as are on YouTube, they're not live streamed, so I can choose. Whereas a friend of mine had an email from their parish priest, and she belongs to an Anglo-Catholic tradition, to remind everybody that when they're watching the live stream of Mass, that they should be modestly dressed. This desire to kind of create those trappings of sacred space in a very different place. And I'm very interested in what prompted that priest to make that comment, why he felt that was important, what he felt threatened about in the life of the domestic that did that, or whether it may have been a particular incident that he wanted to talk about, but whether there's something really underlying that about how we understand the home that's quite troubling.
Yes, feminist angle. Peter, sorry, you were about to speak.
I just spotted a question or a comment in the comments, which is about enforced sabbatical, really, which I totally get. One of it's polarizing us as well. So for me, I'm using that language, but my personal experience has been hard to dial back, an endless activity to acclimatize into this new setting. But for people in my church, for lots of them, not all, this has been that sabbatical. So perhaps there's different experiences that I want to recognize. It's not that simple.
Yes, we talk about lockdown as being a great leveller, and of course Emily Maitlis said famously on Newsnight, it's not a great leveller. We're affected by it, but we're all affected differently, aren't we? Before we go into breakout rooms, Jessica, you've been thinking, you've already really helpfully introduced this concept of power dynamics, haven't you, in talking about the domestic space, and how there's perhaps a little bit of sexism there. More generally, what are you noticing around power dynamics as a result of lockdown?
Thanks, Emma. Well, before joining this, I was very hastily making some notes for a Bible study on 1 Corinthians, and on that passage where Paul talks about how we're all many parts of the same body and we all need need all those different parts to operate. It's this kind of, it draws everyone together and everyone has this important role to play. And I was looking through the commentaries, and there's this interesting idea that Paul is subverting an image that would have been well known to his contemporaries, but we used in a very different way to reinforce hierarchy and to say, you know, actually some parts of the body are less important than others, and you, perhaps poor people, women, slaves, oppressed people, are less important parts of the body. But Paul's kind of subverting this metaphor to bring about a new way of thinking. And it struck me when thinking that, of course, Paul is talking at this time of great change and crisis for his followers. It's an unsettled world. It's a world probably about 20 years after the death of Christ. People are struggling to adapt to the new normal. And a lot of people feel that the end of the world is near, probably including Paul himself. And actually, moments of change and crises like that, and like the one we find ourselves in, are always this opportunity to confront our power dynamics, sometimes perhaps to acknowledge them for the first time, and perhaps reinforcing them because we want to feel safe and we want to hold on to normality. We want the things we're familiar with to bring us comfort. But perhaps an opportunity to question them, because I think, as we've all said already, we're being forced to think about things differently. We can't continue in the same way. That opportunity has been taken away from us. So I'm very interested at the moment in who is now making the decisions. If we have power, how are we enfranchising those who don't? And I think this can manifest in lots of ways, actually. There can be places where power is being given to new people, perhaps because they have particular skills, and I'm particularly aware that for a lot of folk, that's people with technical skills who often go underappreciated in our churches, but now we're becoming, you know, increasingly appreciative and reliant on their skills. Perhaps there's people who've come forward who are able to do new things that help us to experience church and mission in this time. But I'm also aware it can go the other way. And there are churches that perhaps have worked hard on deconstructing the hierarchy, have worked hard on enabling people who have previously not been involved, who've done good work on trying to improve representation, who now have actually started to hoard that power back for themselves. And what interests me particularly is that, for better or worse, we didn't have time to strategize for this. This was a very quick change, a very sudden crisis. And we had to make decisions very quickly. We had to decide who's going to broadcast a Sunday service tomorrow or today, who's going to be sending out newsletters, who's going to try and reach out into the local community, who's going to do shopping for the next door neighbour to the church. And those decisions had to be made very quickly. But we're a few weeks in now, and this is a good time, I think, to say, right, when we made those decisions, which power dynamics did we reinforce? And which did we demolish, perhaps unconsciously? And what do we think of what we've done with that? And is there a way that we can now address, maybe, where we've started to re-hoard that power for ourselves? I think that's probably all I want to say before we talk more.
Thank you. It sounded to me, I wondered why you were speaking. You gave the example of people with technological skills, or perhaps being given more power. But equally, you talked about this crisis of, oh, wow, we have to get a service out or something out. Who's going to do it? I guess it's probably quicker and easier for a minister to do it themselves. But I wonder where the local preachers are in that, for example.
Yeah, and I am a local preacher, and right. I think that is something that we all are trying to engage in. And I think there's quite a good example in one of the circuits that I work in. There was a real desire in that circuit over the last year to improve biblical literacy. They recognised they weren't giving people the opportunities to engage in Bible studies enough, partly because their congregations are quite diverse age-wise, very difficult to pin down time, lots of good reasons, and a really good desire there to engage with lay spirituality. Now, this crisis presented this amazing opportunity to do mission in a way we haven't been able to, because we're now doing a YouTube Bible study a day, which actually is a lot, and was why I was write those 1 Corinthians notes. But, you know, that's an incredible opportunity we've been presented with to do something really radical and positive in that circuit. And at the beginning, but as you say, the easiest thing to do was for the superintendent minister to film all of them. Now, that's not sustainable because the poor man had to do other things, but it's also not a good use of power dynamics. But actually, it's been really interesting how that we've managed to break that down so much more quickly than we normally do, because by week 3, The rest of the staff team were doing them. By week 4, the local preachers were doing them. By week 7, we were inviting some experts from universities, some Anglican priests, some preachers in other traditions to do them. So I think it's really interesting how I think that breaking down would have taken a long time outside lockdown, but in these slightly artificial circumstances, it's taken 2 months. I think I'm interested to know if other local preachers have experienced that at the beginning there was this kind of real disenfranchisement, but whether that's broken down much more quickly than it would have, or whether people feel it's been reinforced for them.
Thank you. And of course, do feel free, everyone, to make comments in the chat about anything that we're saying. And I've noticed that you started to do that, so thank you very much. Before we go into breakout rooms, anything else that any of our panelists would like to add?
I just want to ask a really hard question, really. I'm not sure that I agree with this question, but it is about the quality of stuff that's going out online. And I see that some people are putting up on the chat about, you know, can local preachers start producing this stuff and sending it out? And yeah, that's great, but what is the quality of the stuff? And actually, you know, I've seen some shocking examples up on YouTube, and actually somebody has to hold the quality. I know it's about power, but you know, quality is important right now. There is yeah.
Thank you. Hard question, but that's what this webinar is all about. So thanks very much. We're going to go into breakout rooms now, and we will, all of us, continue our conversation afterwards. But for now, we'd like to give you an opportunity to talk with other participants. So you'll be in breakout rooms for 15 minutes. And for those who haven't used breakout rooms on Zoom before, it's very easy. I'll click a button and then you'll have something come up on your screen that will ask you to join a breakout room, and you just click yes and you go in automatically. I will then click the button after 15 minutes to bring you back into the main session. So the question that we'd like you to consider is this. It's kind of one question, but it's slightly wordy. What norms are being challenged for you right now? What norms are being challenged in your context? And then thinking about those norms, what is the fear and where is the grace? I'll put up a PowerPoint. No, I won't, because the PowerPoint's disappeared. So what is the fear and where is the grace for you in this situation where norms are being challenged? I will also repeat that question by broadcasting it into your breakout rooms in a minute or so's time. So we'll see you in 15 minutes, and we look forward to hearing the result of your conversations. And as we said before, you may want to nominate someone to facilitate your conversation, or at the very least to feedback the results of your conversations. See you in a few minutes.